you see my slide, Transgender Awareness Introduction, Julie Miller? Oh, I see Andy's nodding, good. The technology is working. Okay, firstly, the program for the next 20 minutes. I'm going to look at a statistical overview of the challenges facing transgender people, then a bit of historical analysis of transgender terminology, some science, the transition process, the law, and then questions and answers. So first, and as I said, all these references you can see on the chat function now. And so if you want to go away and buy the books, read the papers yourselves, you can do that. The latest survey that I found on transgender people is the Gallup survey, UK LGBT charity, anti-violence charity, you can see at the bottom there. And in the last 12 months, they did a survey and they asked lots of questions. And in the last 12 months, they found that 80% of respondents had experienced a form of transphobic hate crime. 25% experienced transphobic physical assault or the threat of such. 20% experienced transphobic sexual assault or the threat of such. 70% said that transphobia had an impact on their good health. 50% had self-harmed. And 70% said their daily routine has been affected by transphobia. And 50% felt less able to go out and about. I can't read half of what I'm writing here because people are putting up chat stuff and the writing's coming on. I see pictures, so I can't see half my slides, but I hope you can. So that is a very sad and sobering set of statistics about how people go about their challenging lives as trans people. Right, time for a bit of history. Trans terminology, going back through the ages. And to be more, the first word I want to look at is the word gender, because it's obviously the core of this subject. And here's a description from Julia Sonaro's book, Whipping Girl. Julia Sonaro is a trans activist and speaker and philosopher. And she says the word gender is derived from genus, meaning kind. It is the social organization of our bodies into different categories. As Georgie has just been talking about all these cultures around the world, socially organizing themselves into 5 different genders and 3 different sexes. But it's social organization. Gender is the social organization as opposed to the physicality of the human body. This is Professor J.R. Udry. He is Professor of Maternal and Child Health at the University of North Carolina, or at least he was. And in 1994, he wrote the paper, The Nature of Gender. Now you look this up for yourself at Wikipedia, go on to gender, and this reference will be the first of many references. And in that, he concluded that in a comprehensive bibliography of 12,000 titles, 12,000 papers on the subject of marriage and family literature between 1900 and 1964, not one of them, not one single one of them mentioned the word gender once at all, even. They mentioned sex and sexual procedures and identities, but they didn't mention gender. This is Dr. John Money, who is a very famous American sexologist, and he is attributed with starting to use the word gender as a terminological distinction between biology as a role. And before his work, it was unusual to use the word gender in anything except for grammatical categories, as in French, le, la, as in German, der, die, das. So he assigned gender as towards gender roles, stereotypical man and woman, and woman and man. This is, let me go back one. I've deleted my next famous professor, but he's gone. So anyway, moving on to the historical analysis of the word trans itself. And do you like the graphics? It took me years to do that, to make that. This is Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a German sexologist. He was also a homosexual Jew, which was a very challenging thing to be in Nazi Germany of the early 1900s. But he, first of all, set up the first Institute of Sexology in Berlin, and he started the first of sex change operations. But he came up with the word transvestite to describe a man who wore the clothes of the opposite sex for sexual or social reasons. The word trans means to cross. The word vestitus means clothes, as in the vestibule or a church changing room. And so the word transvestite has exactly the same literal meaning as the word cross-dresser. Now, this was 100 years ago, when the dress codes of society were extremely strict. Men wore predominantly trousers and women wore predominantly dresses and skirts. But in today's society, the 21st century, we are much more liberal about our dress codes. And a man who wears a dress is no more a cross-dresser than is a woman who wears trousers. This is Dr. David Caldwell. He is one of the first sexologists to start using the word transsexual to define someone who changed their sex physically, surgeries or hormones. And he, in his book, or paper, Psychopathia Transsexualis, 1949, he uses the word transsexual. Virginia Prince was a transgender activist around the latter half of the century, and she coined the term transgenderist. She's one of the first people to start using the word transgender, along with, for example, Dr. John Oliver, who's another sexologist. But for Virginia Prince, she used it as a name for a behavior of living full-time, as you can see, as a woman, but without SRS, sexual reassignment surgery. I believe she took hormones, but other than that, she had the male body that she was born with. And she started to use this word transgender. But now we have this term trans, an umbrella term, excuse me. And this is the Stonewall definition to describe a person whose gender is not the same as or does not sit comfortably with the sex they were assigned at birth. Some people use the word assigned, other people take offense to that. They say, no, it's not assigned at birth, it's observed at birth. That's a controversial subject that is played out on Twitter and other social media. So now we have this trans umbrella, and underneath it there are so many different names, terminologies that people have, and there are many, many more. Georgia talked about demi-boys and demi-girls. And I'm not going to try and describe what each of these terms is. We haven't got the time, but it doesn't matter. What it matters is that these words are important to the people who use them, and they have every right to use these words. And that right comes from the Human Rights Act 1998, Article 8, the title of which is, we all have a right to respect for our private and family life. And that means we have a right to determine our sexual orientation. We have a right to our lifestyles and the way we look and dress. We have a right to develop our own personal identities. I identify as a transgender trans woman. A gender fluid trans woman. That is my right. But the difficulty we have is how to get other people to respect and accept our identities. For example, Piers Morgan says, I'd like to identify as an attack helicopter. You can do that, Piers. You can attack anything you like. You can be an attack helicopter, but you won't be respected and accepted for it because you haven't got a set of rotor blades sticking out of your back and you don't make a funny waka waka sound. John Cleese wants to be identify as a Cambodian policewoman. You can do that, John Cleese. But you're from the Ministry of Silly Walks. You're just a very silly person. So no one's going to accept and respect you as a Cambodian policewoman. But these identities, for example, a trans woman, a gender fluid woman, if our communities, our families and our friends accept us, then that's what we need. Gender dysphoria. This is NHS definition, a discomfort or distress relating to a mismatch between biological sex and gender identity. As George has already mentioned, it's an incongruence in the various medical manuals. And dysphoria means unhappiness. And dysphoria, as we've already heard from other speakers, is personal to the person. It can be very mild on a scale of 1 to 10. It can be a 1 or a 2, but in other people, it can be a powerful 10. It's debilitating. They know about it from the age of 4 or 5 upwards, and they have to do something about it. If it's perhaps a 1 or 2, it's something they can live with and just complete their, to hide their identity all their lives. Okay, so we've looked at some trans terminology. We've taken a trip down memory lane for some people. Some people might not remember as far back as the 1900s, but I certainly remember back into the middle of the last century. Science. The history of transgender science, as it's been studied as sexology throughout the 20th century, and then, as we've seen, it becomes studied as a social construct since the 1940s. And then the word transgender has been defined. And as we've heard, it used to be a mental disorder, but now it's not. It's a state of being. It's an incongruence, but it's not a disorder. There's insufficient research to conclude the exact reason for this transgender state of being, but recent innovations are helping. Learning our genes, our DNA, and MRI scanning, peering inside people's brains. So we don't know what causes a person to be transgender, but we do know there are 3 fundamental concepts to human beings in terms of their sex. And the first is that we have our sex, our physical sex, our primary sexual organs, our penis, our vagina, our womb, our prostate, and it is generally accepted to be dimorphic. Again, this is controversial because some scientists say no, sex is a spectrum. But when we go out and about in the streets, as far as we're concerned, it's one or the other, male or female. But then there's our gender, and this is the World Health Organization definition, socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships, and it is regarded as a spectrum. And then we have our sexual orientation. Are you heterosexual, homosexual, asexual, bisexual, trisexual, pansexual? Let's have a look at some studies that have been done recently. This is by the University of Liège in Belgium in 2018. They scanned MRI scanning of 160 trans people, and they found that the person's brains, the activity resembled those of the acquired gender, not the biological sex that they were born with. That's from the European Society of Endocrinology. This is a paper done in 2018 by the American Psychological Association, The Future of Sex and Gender in Psychology, 5 challenges to the gender binary. And they looked at these 5 disciplines, and they found that findings from multiple disciplines provide fundamental challenges to the notion that we can be understood as belonging to only 2 categories, men and women. So there are theories about being transgender, and they can be based on 4 pillars. And if you look at Thomas Bevan's book, he describes them out, these 4 pillars: genetics and DNA, epigenetics, those mechanisms that modify DNA, the effect of other mental issues, cultural upbringings. All of these things, could they make what it is to be transgender? Well, Professor Bevan says no. He focuses on what he calls the two-factor theory, which is genetics and DNA and epigenetics. In other words, he discards the latter 2. And the other studies that are going on focus more and more on these first 2. But it doesn't matter. In our caring, compassionate society in which we live, it doesn't matter what causes a person to be transgender, because all roads lead to gender dysphoria. And we treat that gender dysphoria in our caring, compassionate, loving society. Through the NHS, there are 13 gender identity clinics, and if we are to believe our government, that's going to increase by 3 more, but I'll believe it when I see it. And in those gender identity clinics, of which I've been to, the one in Exeter, we have transition options. And these options are that we can make social changes to ourselves. We can put some makeup on and some nice clothes, and that makes us feel better. And then if that's not enough, we can make physical changes. We can take hormones, we can have surgeries. And thirdly, we can make legal changes. We can change our name by deed poll or by getting, for example, a gender recognition certificate. And each of these changes can be made fully or partially. And for example, many transgender people change their name by deed poll so they can change their passport, their driving license, etc. But not many have actually gone for a gender recognition certificate. If you read Dr. Ben Vincent's book, he will describe this this slide in more detail, transition pathways. But firstly, it's a referral to your GP, and then an appointment with their gender identity clinic. But the current waiting times are sometimes up to 4 years, which is appalling. And at that first appointment, which I've attended, you can be offered hormones or puberty blockers to block the onset of puberty. Puberty blockers is a very controversial subject at the moment and subject to some court cases. For example, a lady called Kira Bell is complaining that she was put onto these things before her time. The findings of that court case will be coming out next week, I'm told. And the second appointment, another wait of at least 8 months, you can go to have surgeries. And some of my trans friends are doing that at the moment, but it's a very, very serious decision to make. And less than 50% of transgender people actually have surgery. Some people say as few as 20%. And if you want to read more about that, have a look at Fair Play for Women, which is a transphobic website, but it actually contains lots of interesting research. And finally, in my presentation, let's talk about the law. And we've had a look at the Human Rights Act, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Equality Act 2010, which looks at these 9 protected characteristics, of which gender reassignment is one of them. And we are protected from harassment, victimization, and discrimination in the place of work, education, or in the provision of a service or a club. And what does it mean to have this characteristic of gender reassignment? Well, it means that we are protected if we are proposing to undergo, we are undergoing, or we have undergone the process or part of the process for the purpose of reassigning our sex or psychological aspects of our sex or other aspects of our sex. In practice, and if we look at the Equality and Human Rights Commission guidelines, they describe this, that, for example, if you are a man who is transitioning to become a woman, and you go to work 4 days a week as a man, and the 5th day you go to work dressed as a stereotypical woman, then you are protected because you must be treated as that stereotypical woman on that 5th day at work. But if you are part of a rugby club and you want to go out for a New Year's party with your fellow rugby players dressed up as Alice in Wonderland, and you're going to put balloons down your breasts and pop them at midnight, then you're not protected, because it's pretty obvious that you don't want to go through the process of gender reassignment. And the second law that is pertinent, again, very controversial, the Gender Recognition Act, allows a person to change their sex marker on their birth certificate and their death certificate from male to female or female to, it's not correctly titled, this gender recognition. It should be called the Sex Recognition Act, because it only allows you to change your sex. But you must be an adult, you must live in your new gender for 2 years, and you must have had psychiatric reports which are put in front of a gender recognition panel. Now, this is a bank of faceless doctors who have never actually met you. Now, how often do you go to the NHS and get a serious diagnosis on your health? It's going to change the way you live for the rest of life, but your doctor's never actually met you. This is what the Gender Recognition Act does, and that's why many people want to change it. But our lovely government have decided, yes, they're going to change it by putting it online and reducing the fee down to about 8 quid instead of 140 quid. That's it. That's all they want to do at the moment. Today is the deadline for putting in your complaints to the government via the Women and Equalities Committee, but you've only got until 5 o'clock this evening to do it, but they are examining the government's decision as to why they have not changed the Gender Recognition Act as much as we'd like to have happened. And there we have it. That's my short burst. There's many more topics that I could have talked about, but time is pressing. So back to you, Joe.